is 1963. The Cold War is heating to a fever pitch. A tense world has witnessed escalation of the Vietnam conflict, the building of the Berlin Wall, the Bay of Pigs invasion, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, bringing civilization to the brink of destruction. But from the unique perspective of one man, there is a lighter side to everything, even Armageddon.
Well, boys, I reckon this is it. Nuclear combat toe-to-toe with the Ruskies.
All right, tell you what you better do, old buddy.
I can no longer sit back and allow communist infiltration to sap and impurify all of our precious bodily fluids.
This man is obviously a psychotic.
I do not avoid women, Mandrake. Yeah. But I do deny them my essence.
Yes. Has that plane really got a chance of getting through?
If the pilot's good, see? I mean, if he's really sharp, he can barrel that baby in so low. I mean, you ought to see it sometime. It's a sight. A big plane like a 52.
By the late 1950s, Stanley Kubrick has become deeply concerned about the possibility of nuclear annihilation.
Stanley became terribly interested in the thermonuclear dilemma. And when we finished Lolita, this was all that was on his mind, the possibilities of a nuclear holocaust.
Kubrick reads over 50 books dealing with the subject of nuclear war. A friend at the Institute of Strategic Studies, Alistair Buchan, recommends a novel by Peter George called Red Alert. Initially intent upon creating a reality-based thriller, Kubrick pays $3,500 for the screen rights to the original 1958 novel, written under the pseudonym Peter Bryant. The novel deals with a rogue United States military officer who attempts to initiate an unauthorized nuclear strike on the Soviet Union. In 1962, Kubrick and his producing partner, James B. Harris, begin to develop a screenplay titled Edge of Doom.
The first thing he did was to have me read the book by Herman Kahn called On Thermonuclear War, which was pretty sophisticated in terms of how it explained everything. Stanley has already read the book probably several times and was an expert on it. We developed the screenplay as a straight drama, a straight suspense story. We would work late into the night, and there were times when it got to be well past midnight, and we started to get a little silly and a little giddy, and started to imagine what it would be like if all of these people in the war room with this terrible problem were hungry and had to eat. I mean, this is the silly stuff that we started to think about. What would they call out to the Gaiety delicatessen?
You don't have any fresh fish?
I'm afraid not, sir.
Your eggs, then, they are fresh?
Oh, yes, sir.
I will have poached eggs.
However, there's nothing humorous about the real-life Cold War, as Kubrick learns when the American government discovers the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba in late 1962.
The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
He had been very disturbed by the Cuban Missile Crisis. Not simply the prospect of nuclear annihilation, not simply, but also by the way that people accepted it fatalistically, that that's probably how the world was going to end, in a huge nuclear bang.
Ultimately, Harris departs from the project with Kubrick's blessing to become a director. Shortly thereafter, Kubrick informs Harris of a major conceptual change for the project.
I got a call from Stanley saying, do you remember when we discussed the possibility of doing this thing as a comedy? He said, you know, I really feel that the best way to tell this story, to make the point, the whole thermonuclear dilemma, is much better said in the form of a satire or a comedy than it is in the straight story that we developed.
He kept coming across various aspects of the story that weren't tragic, but were comic. For example, if a man learns the news that nuclear annihilation is nigh when he's in his office, the result is a documentary. When he's in his living room, it's a social drama. When he's in the bathroom, it's a comedy. And Stanley found that there were a lot of aspects of this subject that were comic.
Kubrick realized that this stuff was so incredible that it could only be taken in and absorbed through a comic lens, through a satiric lens. And that was his great concept for the movie. He started out very literally, to make a very serious film about nuclear gamesmanship, and saw that it couldn't be done as he was in the material, and he came up with this idea of a nightmare comedy.
An early draft opens with extraterrestrials observing Earth in the wake of a nuclear holocaust and is titled The Delicate Balance of Terror. Kubrick decides that the now comedic script requires a degree of inspired lunacy. However, he feels the story should place the absurdities within a realistic framework. He turns to writer Terry Southern, whose novel Candy caused a media sensation with its bold and satiric look at modern sexuality.
I think he contributed a great deal to the satire of the film. Terry Southern was an incredible character with that quirky sense of humor, so he was ideal for the project.
Terry was always a political being and a humanist. The Cold War and the nuclear threat was something that was just part of his existential attitude towards these kinds of things, that it was really just systems of power that were out of control and that should be questioned without a doubt. And Terry was in this unique position of being the hipster, being the existentialist, being at the top of his literary form, and bridging that gap from, let's say, the beats to Hollywood.
Although Kubrick had initially planned to shoot the film in New York, he ultimately decides that Shepperton Studios in England can more suitably accommodate the production. Southern flies to London, and for 2 months he collaborates with Kubrick on the script during some very unorthodox daily writing sessions.
Stanley would say to Terry, "Terry, what's the most outrageous thing this character can say and still be credible?" And so Terry would just go at it, and that's how you'd come up with things like Purity of Essence of Bodily Fluids, and Dr. Strangelove, of course, is probably the best title of all time.
But it seemed to us that probably the subtitle was Stanley's, How I Stopped Worrying and Learned to Love the Bomb, because that doesn't sound like Terry.
Right.
Terry Southern, you know, who was a writer who had a very sort of kinky sense of humor.
Terry is a bad boy, you know. He's ideal for writing the edgy part of Strangelove.
With the help of Terry Southern, he constructed, I think, the most perfectly written comic screenplay of the post-war cinema.
With the screenplay almost complete, Kubrick turns his attention to building the ambitious sets required for Dr. Strangelove at Shepperton Studios.
He was fascinated by my wartime record as a fighter pilot, so and he was a frustrated pilot himself, and we immediately hit it off, which finally resulted in my driving him to and from Shepperton Studios, where we were making Strangelove, in my E-Type Jaguar, which then was a fastest sports car. Stanley insisted on my driving at not over 30 miles an hour, which was miserable, but you get to know each other pretty well.
Much of the action in Dr. Strangelove takes place in the now legendary War Room. Although no such place actually exists, Kubrick insists that the set reflect a totally realistic atmosphere. He reviews Ken Adams' initial sketches for the War Room set.
He loved it. He said, "That's exactly right, you know, you've got it." And I said, "You know, yeah, everybody is telling me this man is so difficult to work with." And in my first conversation with him, I seemed to be getting there. So I was so optimistic. And then, as always with Stanley, about 3 or 4 weeks later, we were driving to Shepperton, and he said, "Gee, Ken, I've been thinking about that War Room. You've put it on 2 levels, and what am I going to do with the 70 extras on the upper level? And I think you have to rethink your concept." And I was really thrown, because I had to start from scratch. I tried to calm down by taking a walk in the grounds at Shepperton Studios. And then, after I was sufficiently calmed down, started doodling again on different ideas.
Adam designs a set that will become legendary. To build the War Room, he employs more than 150 tradesmen. The set measures 130 feet long, 100 feet wide, and 35 feet high. The centerpiece is a table 22 feet in diameter.
Stanley liked it and said, "Can you cover it in green baize?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, I can cover it in green baize, but, you know, we're shooting black and white. That doesn't make any difference, because I want to give the impression that these 26 characters sitting around this table are involved in a gigantic poker game for the fate of the world.